Now, programming from the Illinois Channel, an independent, nonpartisan corporation formed to provide nonpartisan coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois. For more information on the Illinois Channel, please visit our website at www.illinoischannel.org.
Just ahead, we head to the City Club of Chicago for a panel discussion titled Illinois School Funding Formula, Is It Fair? Panelists include State Senators Karen McConaughey and Andy Madier, and State Representatives Barbara Flynn Curry and Ron Sandak. Following that, in about 50 minutes from now, Eric Madier, the former Chief Legal Counsel for Senate President John Cullerton, addresses an audience of the State University's Annuitants Association about the legal challenges to pension reform. That's all just ahead, after a brief word from one of our Advisory Council members.
Hi, I'm Matt Hart, Executive Director of the Illinois Trucking Association. For over 80 years, we've represented the interests of those who work in the Illinois trucking industry. We work with members of the legislature to pass laws to help make the roads safer, to help keep Illinois trucking competitive, and to help provide ongoing educational opportunities for those in our industry. The technology of trucking is forever changing. So too are the laws regulating the trucking industry. That's why the Illinois Trucking Association is proud to support the work of the Illinois Channel, which keeps citizens around Illinois connected to what's happening in state government and what changes are being discussed that will impact their families, their communities, their future. And the Illinois Channel gives those of us in industry an opportunity to share our thoughts on public policy with our fellow citizens across Illinois. I'm Matt Hart, Executive Director of the Illinois Trucking Association. I'm also proud to serve on the Illinois Channel's Advisory Council on Transportation. The Illinois Channel, it works for all of us.
Next, from the City Club of Chicago, a panel of House and Senate lawmakers discuss whether Illinois' school funding formula is fair, and if not, what changes should be made to it. This runs about 50 minutes.
We'll have, starting with Karen McConaughey, a few opening comments on what you see as the, what do you see?
Wow, where do you start with that? First of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. It's obvious by the attendance that this is a really important issue. It certainly is to all of us. Education funding to us is the most important challenge and the most important responsibility that we have. And it's an honor to sit with three other people who I hold in high regard, and each and every one of them is concerned and losing as much sleep at night over this issue as I am. In particular, Senator Madier and I, we came in together as two former county board chairs. We've been working on this issue for 3 years now, haven't we? And I think what's interesting to note is that none of us disagree on the importance of making some changes to a funding formula that is unfair. We may have different ideas about how to get there. Some things we agree on, some things that we disagree on. But ultimately, I think that there is a reason to be hopeful for the future because we see the need and we see the pathway. When you talk about what's unfair, it depends on perspective, but I think that the complexity of our current formula talks about lots of unfairness. It is unfair that, I guess if you want to call it that, CPS has a provision that allows them much greater flexibility on third-party contracting and management rights that no other school district has in the state. At the same time, CPS pays for its pension when no other school district in the state pays for its pension. So you have, right there, you have two different problems. How we fund education is terribly out of balance. When you look at a community, a district like mine, most of my communities, the property taxpayers are paying on average 90% of the total cost of educating our kids, which means we get less than, in many cases, less than 10% of funds from the state of Illinois. Downstate, where Senator Madier comes from, there's a lower tax base and a demand for more resources. One of the things that frustrates taxpayers in my district, which is part of what makes this so challenging, is when you pay a high amount of property tax in the suburbs, as I do, and you look at the city of Chicago, and I hope that I don't get thrown out of the room for saying this, but a world-class economy, a community where only about 42% of the cost of public education is coming from the property tax base. That is problematic when trying to resolve this problem, because I got to go back and be able to explain to my constituency why proportionately we pay more to educate our kids. Has nothing to do with how much money is needed. I think we all understand that long term is going to require additional money. We all understand that we've got to put more money into it, and we have to ensure that every single child in this state gets not just an adequate education, but a high quality education, and that includes the kids in CPS, it includes the kids in the suburbs, and it includes all the kids in downstate Illinois who will be the first ones to see their schools close if we don't get to a budget deal this week. So I'm optimistic that we're going to put our differences aside and get that resolved this week.
Round of applause. Very good. I'd like to hear now from one of my favorite state senators, Andy Madier.
Thank you. Thank you. Hope I don't disappoint. Thank you for having me. Second time in 2 months. We had a budget panel back in May, which was timely and continues to be timely to this day. This discussion today on school funding in our system in the state today is incredibly timely because of challenges that districts across the state are facing. Of course, here at CPS, in my own district back in Bunker Hill, in Macoupin County, the home of Vince DiMuzio, who frequented this room many times. Let me begin here. Our system today is completely rotten in Illinois. It's rotten at its core. It is punitive to children that live in poverty, and there's no metric that you could assess with in Illinois that would cause us to continue to preserve the system that we have today. That's a strong set of statements, but I believe it to be true, and I think as the conversation continues into year, I guess, 3 now on school funding in the Senate and in the House, that continues to be the case. Let me throw out a couple of statistics that I think ought to be troubling to everybody in this room and beyond. In the state budget, 40% of what we have, whether it's a lot or not a lot every year, only 40% asks the question, do you need it? So only 40% of the money that we have in the state budget today goes through the filter of need or demand. That's the lowest of any state in the country. Number 2, there's an inverse correlation between property tax rates and per pupil spending. And my guess is we're going to have a hefty debate about property taxes today, which we should in the state. But generally speaking, the districts with higher tax rates in the state, across the state, spend less per pupil. So much so that there are districts in Illinois today that couldn't tax themselves into equity even if they wanted to. And that's a problem. That didn't exist years ago when the current funding formula was put in place, when Senator Berman was in the Senate and led that charge. But it exists today. It's reality. So there are districts in the state that already have the highest tax rates, that are well below adequate spending, well below the state average, that couldn't tax themselves enough, even if they wanted to bring about equity to get the outcomes that we want from every school district and local school districts. A third point, we spend less on children that live in poverty as compared to children that don't live in poverty, which is opposite of what we ought to be doing with our state funds. We don't prioritize state funds to classrooms that serve children that live in poverty. It's about 81 cents on the dollar. So for every dollar that's spent on a child that doesn't live in poverty in Illinois, 81 cents is spent on a child that does, which is opposite. Other states get this right. Diverse states like Ohio get this right. They have a progressive funding formula that results in better outcomes from some of the most challenged classrooms in the state of Ohio. We could do that in Illinois. It's going to take a change in public policy. And then finally, I'll just end on this point, back to the issue of all children that live in poverty in the state, no matter where they live. On average, in a given year, a child that lives in poverty has $2,000 less spent on his or her education. $2,000 per year for 13 years. So step away from this panel discussion and think about that in the life of a child that lives in a neighborhood or a small town that has only known poverty his or her entire life. That's substantial. And that has an impact on our budget. It has an impact on outcomes of public schools, and that has to be changed. And the only way we're going to do this is either by spending more money and directing that money toward those classrooms where those children go to school, or by changing what we have today, or doing a combination of both. The State Senate has led this effort, and I'm very proud to be one voice in that effort. We've passed multiple bills over to the House, and they're being considered. And we've tried the approach of recognizing the difficult policy discussion that, you know, Karen and I and Ron and Barbara have had for well over a year now between the House and the Senate. But something's got to change because despite the budget impasse, if we don't change how we direct money to schools, this problem is going to continue to plague us for years to come. Thanks again for the invitation. Look forward to the questions.
Okay. State Representative Sandek, you're up.
So it's difficult following Andy Menard in any conversation about public education because he has been a leading voice for reform, I think, for 3 years running now. And to his credit, he has been transparent and very open about what he sees as deficiencies in the system. And to his credit, he has not wavered. And he has my respect for that. But the practical sometimes has to supersede the theoretical. And where we are today, Andy first brought SB 16. It passed out of the Senate, I think it was 3 years ago, give or take. SB 1 was next. It passed out of the Senate. And most recently, SB 231. Now, they're not identical. They're principally similar, but there are technical differences. And Andy has worked very hard to move a bill that could be introduced in the House and a conversation could follow. For reasons beyond the ken of my abilities and beyond the scope of being in the minority party, those bills have never really been introduced in the House. So the folks in charge of the legislature, at least, haven't brought a unified plan towards reforming public education spending. I do think Andy's bills ought to be vetted at the House in a far more transparent manner. It just hasn't happened. I will say that anyone that knows anything about public education will say that it can be done far better. And I was thinking this weekend, the topic is it fair? And obviously fairness is always in the eyes of the beholder. It's entirely subjective. But I think almost anyone that pays 5 minutes attention to public education and has a conscience would say, at the very least, it's outdated, it has bad outcomes, and could be done and should be done far better. Fairness, in all fairness, is a destination that we constantly look to achieve. I don't know that we do it in any realm of state government. I don't think higher education is funded fair. I don't think how we fund public infrastructure. You ask those that bid on those contracts if it's a fair process, you may hear some grumbling. In fact, if you're not, unless you live under a rock, you know that we're having a little bit of a problem finding a budget solution on a macro level in Illinois. That's entirely unfair. So while I was, noodling this concept, a couple things came to me. One, we should be working on this far better. We're not doing it right. So the Senate sends over some concepts to the House, which have yet to be meaningfully addressed. The majority leader, Barbara Flynn Curry, has led a year-long bipartisan process. I'm in that committee. We have met. We have heard from superintendents, stakeholders, from all aspects and segments of Illinois education. Now, we haven't drafted a bill. We haven't done anything different for the formula. In fact, the bill the Democrats in the House passed out and sent to the Senate on a macro level, which was a funding budget for everything, had more money in it for education, for CPS, but it didn't change the funding formula. And when the bill that the K through 12 bill that came over from the Senate went down in flames in the House. So we're doing it wrong. We ought to be doing it far different. Republicans had a unified plan that hasn't seen the light of day, such as the life of the feckless minority. But we ought to be doing it differently. We ought to be working in bipartisan groups. We can start with Andy's bill or any other bill. And frankly, there's other bills out there too. Senator Berkman, Andy's colleague and Karen's colleague in the Senate, has kind of an evidence-based proposal. Will Davis in the House has an evidence-based model. There are other, I think Senator Lightfoot has a bill. There's bills out there. Now, we've never put them in the House. We don't take them out of committee and vet them. which I have a fundamental process problem with. I think we ought to be doing that. I think we ought to be doing far more in a transparent manner to fix an outdated, overly complex, burdensome calculation, if you will. We can be doing it far simpler. And I'll say one more thing before we pass it along. Karen and Andy made reference to it. I'm a suburban legislator. You want to get people all ginned up, come to the western suburbs and talk about property taxes because they're outrageous. They are absolutely outrageous. A full 90% of my tax bill goes to pay for my K through 12 and higher education. Do I like how it's allocated? Did I have any voice in how it's allocated? Those are, I think, rhetorical questions to a large extent. But you want to gin up a voter? Tell him or her that they have to pay more in taxes, which has been essentially what the funding discussion has boiled down to for many suburban voters. I'd prefer far more evidence, outcome-based processes that talked about trying to find baselines for everyone, whether you're from Naperville, Hyde Park, Bunker Hill, wherever. We got to be doing this better, and I think we can. We can finally get towards the road towards fairness or move towards fairness, but we have to do it far better.
Okay, round of applause for Barbara, you're up.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank all of you for being here. I'm delighted to be part of this very distinguished panel, people who are truly experts in state government and education reform. Senator Madier is absolutely right. We treat the least among us in a totally shabby, inappropriate, shameful fashion. $2,000 per year per child, $2,400 per year per child if that child happens to be a member of a minority group and also someone who lives in poverty. I'd have to first say, having been in the Assembly for some time, I know it's my fault we haven't solved the problem by now. In any case, I'm still working on it. That this is not a new problem. Senator Berman is here, and many years ago, Senator Berman was picking up the cudgels for a fairer system of funding public education. Communities like Fort Heights, communities in the south suburbs, for example, Andy is right, no matter how heavily they tax themselves, they still will not put enough money into the system to do an adequate job for the children in their classrooms. Part of the problem, I would say, is that the state itself has not stepped up to the plate. So the average property tax dollar in Illinois, 60 cents goes to pay for public schools, the rest for other kinds of municipal and other services. Nationwide, that number is closer to 40 cents on the dollar. So when you complain, Ron, that your property taxes are too high, it's partly because state government has failed to step up to the plate. Now, I have great admiration for Senator Madier, who did yeoman's work over these last several years trying to put together a program that was adequate to the task of promoting equity and also responded to the problems that developed along the way. When you go from a theoretical formula, all of a sudden someone says, oh, wait a minute, you forgot about this issue or that. So he did the fine-tuning that was necessary. But the difficulty that I would say we confront is, as someone who's led the task force that Ron mentioned over the last 2 years, there's not a single person that's come before our task force who has not agreed that school funding in Illinois is inequitable. But what people are also concerned about is the level of adequacy. So let me give you an example. A superintendent from a relatively well-off community in DuPage County. Over time, it turns out that his school district now, about 30%, about a third of the students are low income, and many of them are English language learners. Under the proposals that Senator Madier has pressed appropriately, he would lose $5 million. Well, his view is that he doesn't have the resources if he wants to do what those low-income kids need in his area. He doesn't have the resources to fill the gap. So I would say that one of the things we really ought to be doing, and one of the things Senator Berman worked on in 1995 when former Governor Jim Edgar was in charge, was a program that would actually raise some additional resources so that we could do a better job overall. At the same time, we are looking specifically at the major issue of inequity in today's funding system. So we are working on that in my task force. The budget working group that the governor has asked people to come together with doesn't have long-term solutions yet, but I'm hopeful that at some point we will figure it out. One of the charges the governor gave, not to the stopgap budget working group, but to the earlier one, was find the resources we need as well as the cuts we must make in order to be able to make Illinois whole. Well, that's an effort that we're still engaged in, and it would, I would say, behoove us to continue that progress, make sure that we make progress, and come back to the governor, the leaders, and our colleagues in the House and Senate and say, here, finally, we can get a job done.
Thank you. If you have questions, one of the people who are outside will be coming in to collect those questions. There she is, little Caitlin. All right, if you have a question, raise your hand. The professor will start off, like Lawrence Spivak, Mr. Roebling. You remember him. Thank you for that. I've taught this for, well, as long as Barbara's been in the House. And all of you are articulate, all of you are correct in what you say, but still, this is like a tennis match, and each one's using a different ball. You're not hitting back the balls to each other. Moreover, the property tax issue is a big issue. I was a former suburbanite office holder. One thing property taxpayers do have, it's tax deductible. And they take it off the top of their income tax. And it goes for their own schools. So, 4 words. Paula Wolf's not here, right? Good. I basically limit any discussion of any of this to 4 words. Who pays, who gets? Who pays? You all say someone, you need more money. Who's going to pay? Who's going to get? That's the issue. All of your articulate discussion is right on target, but the key issue is who pays? If you need more money, if it's an equitable funding, fine. Where's the money going to come from? Who's going to pay? Are suburban property tax owners going to pay more state income tax for that, so that those dollars go to the state and they don't go to their district? Tough sell. Or in Chicago, where you're paying your own pension costs, everyone, and you're also paying for everybody else's, what about them? Who's going to pay? Where is the money going to come from? And last but not least, because I am the king of cheap shots, I know one place you're not going to go. That's, of course, to the Friends of the Park. So if had to do it. Okay, anyone wants to jump in? Who pays, who gets? How are you going to get more revenue, and where's that going to come from? Don't all jump at once.
Well, as I said, as a member of the governor's long-term working group, we have been looking at questions about revenue, how we could get more, and how we could solve some of the problems that we are facing, not just problems in education. You know, there was a report from United Way that said that there are 1 million people out there in need of social services who aren't getting any because the state can't do a stable long-term budget. 45% of the state social service agencies are laying people off. It's not only the schools that need stability and need fair and adequate funding, but it's a whole range of social. I understand that the people who provide food in the state prisons aren't getting paid. And we all know that there is a crisis in road construction. If we don't start soon, the summer will be over, and there is at this point no capital budget in order to make roads work. So we have a lot of problems, not just the one we are discussing today, and I'm hopeful that we can figure out, as the governor's mission says, a grand bargain in this working group that would solve the problems with new revenues and with significant cuts in state spending.
Anyone else jump in?
Yeah, I'll jump in. We referenced earlier the evidence-based model that is beginning to build a lot of bipartisan support in the General Assembly, and one of the reasons for that is that when you talk about funding, the concept is the funding tracks with the child and that individual child's needs, whatever that might be for that child. That's how you determine the amount of funding. So a child in poverty gets the same consideration, whether from the city of Chicago, from the suburbs, or downstate. That combined with the formula directly addresses ability to pay. So not what you're paying in property tax, not what your assessed value is, but what is your community's ability to pay. There is, Senator Madier has a very different property tax challenge in his part of the state than I have. But at the end of the day, we're still paying high property tax. The ability to demonstrate a level of transparency where you can identify how children are how their education is being funded and who's contributing what, makes it a lot easier. My communities will probably pay the same, maybe even more under that kind of a formula change, but it's transparent and it's based on local ability to pay. So I think that is one of the ways that we can look at that going forward. How do we get to something that all of us can live with? And it is one of the areas where we're beginning to build some bipartisan support.
Yeah, let me make the point that we shouldn't just ask the question who's going to pay and who gets what. We should ask the question what's affordable. We have to ask what's affordable too. And I think the bill that is my mic going to go off?
I really like this.
Yeah, I just failed.
Yeah.
I just failed.
No, been at least, what, 10 minutes?
So we have to ask what's affordable. And Leader Curry mentioned Senate Bill 231. There's a cost associated with that bill, but there should be a cost associated to improving a system. We tried improving a system at a neutral cost, and that was Senate Bill 16. And that was rejected by just about every Republican in the legislature because, according to those words, it set up a system of winners and losers. So we attempted the approach of trying to change the system using current resources, and that was rejected. Senate Bill 231, which is pending in the House, builds in hold harmless provisions, is phased in over time. That comes with a cost that's associated that has to be paid for. It has to be paid for, which means we have to have a revenue conversation, not just to address our structural problems with our budget, but with structural problems with school funding. So it's an affordable option. That's my point. 231 is an affordable option to begin that transition into a new system to right the wrongs that we have in the state today.
And
Professor, let me answer the question. I'll try and be far more succinct. It was structured, SB 16 and SB 1 was structured where the suburbs paid and the city and other school districts received. That was the equation then. Senator Madier has put forward a new proposition. It has not been vetted at all in the House. Good, bad, right, or wrong. Again, I don't set the docket. I can't get anything out of rules, let alone on the floor. So I'd love to have that debate. But the fact of the matter is the structures we have seen has been bad for suburban voters, and it's been subsidizing other parts of the state. That's not kosher to my voters, so I'm never going to vote for it. Surprise. Would I like something that is far more evidence-based, that's far more equitable, that addresses adequacy fairly? Look, no one wants any kid to not get a good education. She or he is entitled to some baselines, and frankly, the formula that now exists tries to do that, but as Barbara said, over the years it's become so complex and multi-leveled, it's unmanageable. We can and should do better, but right now, what was before us, and we never got the chance to talk about 231, what we talked about hypothetically was where suburbs paid more, and that was just patently unfair.
So,
Okay.
may I respond?
Sure, quick.
Okay. Which suburbs? So in Senate Bill
Fort
231, let's dive into CPS. Let's dive into this. Senate Bill 231 has been called a bailout. Options that have been, filed in both the House and the Senate have been tabbed with that word. But the bill the Senate passed, there were 104 school districts that received more money proportionally per student than CPS. 56 of those were in the suburbs. 56 of those school districts were in the suburbs for the fact that they're underfunded today. There are suburban communities in Illinois today that have underfunded classrooms that pay the highest property taxes in the state of Illinois. And the current funding formula, the proposal that the governor's put forward, doubles down on that approach. It digs that hole deeper for another year so that when we finally decide to get out of the hole, we have a bigger hole to climb out of. That's why I think we need to change this system today. So I just want to be careful about, putting the state into these geographic sections, which, puts roadblocks in front of us to have the conversation about how to have reform.
Okay.
In that bill, it was split between the suburbs and downstate. CPS was 105th on the winner list, as it's called. But let's remember, the suburbs, it's not a cohesive group of school districts. There are districts in the suburbs that are underfunded today.
You meant
I would just wanna
not paying the
add if
most
I-
in property taxes, the highest property tax rates.
Rates, correct.
Right,
Right.
rates, there's a difference.
Dollars
All right,
versus
here we go.
rates, right.
We'll get back to this. Barbara, it's not so easy controlling all this, is it?
I was going to say the evidence-based model, of course, would also require additional resources. I think the price tag they've set is about $5 billion. So there's nothing about school reform funding that is going to be inexpensive. The reality is you can't do it on the cheap, and that's part of the reason we are in trouble today. And you talk about who gets, who pays. Well, right now, in the suburbs that are affluent, they are paying a very significant share of their property tax dollars to fund their schools. And that's, again, back to the main point, and that is that the state is not stepping up to the plate. And until the state does, property taxes will be the major force funding schools across the state of Illinois. A big problem if you're Fort Heights, because you don't have property value. It's a different kind of problem for Ron Sandak's district and for Karen McConaughey's, but it doesn't mean that it isn't a problem because they are cranky about their property. Although I must point out there was some talk earlier about Chicago's property taxes and what happens in the suburbs. It turns out that the operating tax rate for Chicago Public Schools is higher than it is in any of the school districts in Ron Sandak's district. I thought I'd just mention that. Now,
Just throw that in.
I would be happy to compare property tax bills with you any day of the week, right?
You bring in a lot of money with your tax rate, so I...
Yeah.
All right. We got a lot of questions. And I was showing uncharacteristic restraint for not responding to all that because I am the moderator. And let's get going. State Controller Leslie Munger, you sent me an essay. I will try and read it. Today, the cost of pension contributions is nearly 25% of our state's budget. Next year, it will be higher. We spent $8 billion. Is that billion? We should be spending about $2 billion. How about working aggressively on constitutional pension reform to bring those costs down so we can direct some of that savings to education rather than limit it to the state dollars of suburban districts who already pay the highest property taxes in the country? Sounds like she's running for office, doesn't it? All right. Well said. Well said. Who wants to comment on that? Here.
She's right.
All in.
Yeah, we're
It's
for
been a
it.
problem since I've been in the General Assembly. She's right. We spend way too much on pensions, and it's draining resources in such a way as we short infrastructure, we short higher ed, we short K through 12 funding. We short because we pay so much in pensions.
But it's difficult to find a way out that is constitutionally legitimate. And in fact, the legislature sponsored bills 2 years ago that said we're going to restructure pensions for those currently retired or members of the workforce, and the court said, you can't. They said, no, you may not. And they didn't provide us a roadmap that said if you did A, B, or C, that would be okay. They basically said, for current and retired state employees, we're shutting the door. Now, starting in 2011, new hires have come under a very different kind of pension system, and that's totally legitimate. So we're trying to work through, are there options, for example, offering to current state employees a different kind of program? Would enough of them accept it? Would it save enough money? Would even that meet constitutional scrutiny under the terms that the Illinois Supreme Court has set? But we're all not only aware of it, but we're all working hard on it because, yeah, you can't fund all those social services, education funding reform if you are spending all of your money on pensions.
Okay. No. Eileen Makovich, where are you? Raise your hand. There. Well, Eileen, you'll be moving on up. What about private corporations and foundations supporting schools in their district? Miss Albertine? No, you're not. Go ahead. Anyone. Private foundations and corporations basically funding schools.
Well, I wouldn't say funding schools, but I do think that the corporate community does a lot to step up to the plate and help us out. There, in my neighborhood, there were people from, I think it was AT&T, who were painting school rooms, hallways, what have you. That's a wonderful kind of thing, and some of them do help promote and train people who might decide they want to become teachers. I don't think we can turn the basic funding proposition over to the private sector, but I am grateful for all the help we can get.
Anybody else want to jump in? Okay, Wendy Catton, where are you, Wendy? What specific revenue proposals do you support to fund public schools adequately? Hearing lots of analysis and not many solutions. And we have that. And do you support pension parity? Kind of a mild question coming from Wendy, to be honest with you.
Well, I certainly support pension parity. In fact, if we had pension parity, if Chicago were responsible for everybody's pension but not only responsible for its own, we would be spending, since Chicago are 20% of the students, and we're spending about $4 billion on downstate teacher pensions in the coming fiscal year, that means we'd be giving $800 million new dollars to Chicago. I could be for that.
Of course she could. She could also be, and I could be for that too, if we had Chicago grant block parity, if we had third-party contracting parity, if we had PE parity, if we had driver's ed parity. Everything we do in Springfield, by and large, I've learned this was the neophyte, again, suburban Republican, when you see a bill that has certain proximity and or population parameters around it, it tends to be a for Chicago piece of legislation or against Chicago piece of legislation. We, for decades, separated the state geographically. To Andy's point, I think he's right. We shouldn't be doing this on education. We largely shouldn't be doing it at all. Certainly there are aspects of our state that are unique and diverse and should be identified sometimes, but never isolated. So I'm for pension parity so long as we have education parity and we have funding parity and we have parity as a whole. When that day comes, you'll see me with the majority leader on the pension parity vote.
You're doing kumbaya. It's a kind of pretty picture.
Okay. Chris, help me with your last name. Grozev? Not bad. Okay, and by the way, I know like some of you who write this big, Chris has very good printing. Here we go. When can we expect, oh, Jesus, nice printing, nice soft question. When can we expect Chicago public school teachers to pay the 9.4% into their retirement portfolios that they haven't paid in years, or at least to contribute more than they are now? Wouldn't this help the funding formula? I'll answer it, yes.
Well, first of all, there are many school districts that have contracts with their teachers that say that the district will pick up the pension cost. And let me tell you that, in fact, often it's a really good deal for the district. Because if you just put that money in salary, that really is true. So if you put the money in salary, you raise the base. So next year, if you're talking about salary negotiations, you're starting from a higher base. If instead you're picking up some portion of the pension payment, then the school district doesn't have to start from a higher base when contract negotiations happen next. This is not just a Chicago issue. I'm prepared to let the people in Chicago negotiate their contract and make a decision about what they do with the pension payment. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would echo
Thanks, Karen.
the leader's remarks. We don't tell the Decatur School District how to negotiate a contract when it comes to their teachers. We don't tell Harrisburg how to negotiate their contract. We leave it up to the locally elected school board and their administration and those that have a say-so in these decisions. You know, back up to the cost of pensions in the budget for a moment. The TRS payment, and maybe the comptroller could correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's going up about $300 million this year from FY 16 to the proposed 17 budget to make the complete
$4
payment.
billion.
So there's no debate about paying that.
Yeah.
You know, there's no debate in Springfield about do we or do we not pay the increased cost of pensions for TRS. It's being paid. There isn't a word of debate about that. So when it comes to the Chicago Teacher Pension Fund, you know, there's a flurry of debate. And the question is, how are we or are we going to pay for it? And so this idea that we can reform schools without addressing the Chicago Teacher Pension Fund, to me, is complete nonsense. We have to do it. And believe me, it doesn't get me any votes in my district by saying this, but it has to be done one way or the other. We have to take steps toward that parity. It's not going to happen overnight, but it can happen and it has to be done.
And efforts in the House and the Senate this spring were really geared in that direction. So one of the bills that passed the House that provided an equity grant that was much more beneficial to school districts that were in economic need outside the city of Chicago than to Chicago itself. Same thing was true of the bill that passed the Senate, Both of those bills provided some support for the Chicago Teacher Pension Fund, just in terms of operating support. I think the Senate version gave them about $200 million, which is the operations cost. The House was only half as generous. It's so like the House, half as generous as the Senate. But in any case, both chambers did say, yeah, we should begin to do something, and we started with the actual costs of the coming year, of the new costs that the system would incur.
Well, this is definitely an area that when you talk about fairness, there's unfairness about this across the state, not just in the city, not just downstate, because except for the city of Chicago, every school district essentially has the luxury of negotiating and not worrying about paying the bill. So they can agree to pick up the employee's portion of the pension contribution and not have to worry about how it's being paid for, because that's what we do at the state. Then we have to try to figure out how to meet that obligation. You know, this is another area where, again, we're not all anti-Chicago. This is another element that really contributes to what brings the whole system down.
Okay, moving on. By the way, a lot of questions. Many of them are similar, so I'm skipping over them. Carolyn Balicki, where are you, Carolyn? All right. CPS parent. This is for you, Karen. Not in your district, so you could swing for the fences. Are you advocating vouchers within Illinois?
You know, here's the thing about vouchers. That I think that's a decision that should be made on a district-by-district basis, because vouchers may be an important tool in a school district's portfolio in one school district and may not have any relevancy in another. This really speaks, in my mind, to the ability to empower our local school districts to make as many of their own decisions as they possibly can.
Okay, this one's for you, Ron. Get ready. You know what's coming. This is from Tom McDougal. Where are you, Tom? Doesn't want to raise it. Right over there. Close. Okay.
He's my constituent, be careful.
This is to Ron. Are you saying that your wealthier voters are unwilling to help fund education for poor children? That's not a sandbag. That's just a straightforward question.
I want you to know.
Absolutely not. We're doing it right now. So
Tom is my
not.
constituent. I just want you to know that for the record.
God love the City Club, right? Sandbagging
Can
all
I
over
just
the
a
place.
little
All right.
historical footnote, and that again, when Arthur Berman was in the state Senate, he carried the bill. I was the House sponsor, Governor Edgar's bill, and what that provided was an increase. Oh my heavens, think about it, in the state individual income tax to do a better job of funding school districts, particularly those that were filled with children with high levels of poverty. And you know what? The bill passed the House with votes to spare, Republican and Democratic votes. It got stuck in the Senate because one of my favorite Chicago haters, Philip, was then the guy in charge of what got heard in the Senate. But it is not unprecedented to say that people who represent people with more wealth would be willing to step up to the plate, and that was an example.
You know, I think just because you're in a position where you have to explain the challenge from your voters, your taxpayers' perspective, doesn't mean that you're not committed to providing the very best for all children in Illinois. But it's a complex issue, and when you want to know why Ron Sandeck and I are not voting for something, you want to understand what is going on in our districts that cause us not to support something. That's part of what our challenge here is to get to some place where we can afford to do something for all kids. I mean, that's what we're going to be dealing with this coming Wednesday. We've got competing competing proposals. You know, we're coming from a position that let's do something short term that gets kids back into school, open school on time, something that we can afford. There's a counter proposal that says we got to throw another $700 million at it. Where's that money coming from? This is the kind of discussion, because guess what? When I go back to my district, if I vote, I may think, even if I think that $700 million is worthwhile, I have to explain to my taxpayers, because they're going to be picking up part of that tab, Why was that relevant? That's why moving to formulas and a way of doing things that offer the greatest transparency allows us to indicate, wherever you come from in the state, that you are doing a fair and adequate job of providing education for all children. I care about the kids in Andy's district where they have classrooms where they have one computer for an entire classroom. Sometimes they don't even have that. Is that morally, we have an obligation to make sure that those kids have the same quality education that the kids in my district have. So just because we explain and have to represent our districts doesn't mean that we're not equal. Wouldn't be up here. I wouldn't be spending all the time with Andy Madier I've been for the last 3 years.
No, that gotta hurt his feelings.
I love him dearly.
All right, all right. We have a couple of more questions. A lot of these are repetitious. And we have one from Ed Sullivan.
Oh, my God.
There he is.
There he is. A nice, moderate question. Should I read it? You're ready for it. Here we go. You wrote it. A measure of taxpayer fairness is the percent of value of a house paid in property taxes. House in Lake County typically pays 3.4% of the value. Is that a fact? Yes. Okay. Parts of Chicago pay only 1.5% of the value. How does the reform discussion address this inequity? Is it inequality? That's a very fair sandbag question. Andy, why don't you take it?
Well, we can talk about classification.
By the way, before you take it, this is more pub for Art Berman in the history of this club than today. And Pate Phillips' name has been mentioned for the first time ever. Go ahead, Andy.
Part of, Representative Sullivan knows that part of our discussion in the Senate has been how do we devote more resources to CPS pensions. You know, I think on 2 occasions we've passed out of the Senate a bill that would allow the city to raise its property taxes, to devote that money to help shoring up that pension system that needs it. I've said consistently myself throughout our hearing process for the last 2 years that this absolutely has to be part of the conversation. There's reasons why it is the way it is. I'm less interested in the reasons. I'm more interested in trying to find parity on pensions, on property taxes, which you articulated in the question, on how we devote more resources to students that live in poverty, whether they live in Lake County or, you know, in Alexander County, in the deep southern part of the state, but absolutely has to be part of the conversation. Right. We've advanced that measure twice in the Senate.
And the House, I believe, has also passed legislation twice that would say that there will be a levy specific to pensions in the city of Chicago, and I believe, Representative Sullivan, you voted for it too. So thanks for your vote.
Well, he's going to always vote for something where Chicagoans pay for Chicago, benefits. Yeah. But Ed's point is, you heard the concept of pension parity. That's a fair point. Property tax parity is not something that I've heard a heck of a lot of from proponents of either school funding or any other aspect of some things that, that happen in Springfield. So I was pleased to hear Andy talk about that. That needs to be part and parcel of the process. So if we're going to have pension parity, property tax parity, frankly, governance parity with respect to some of the things that CPS can do that other schools cannot do, I think we now have a framework where we can start moving ahead. But those things have been disparate and not, at least in a bill that I've seen, that I've been able to vote on. Those have not been something introduced on the floor just yet.
Well, except also it's worth pointing out that the Chicago operating tax rate for public schools is pretty high compared, as I said, for example, to the schools in Representative Sandak's district. The difference is that in Cook County, there's classification of real property. So you may bring in the same total amount, but the mix of payers is somewhat different. And that's a whole separate discussion. And I would just
I'm fine for assessment parity too, if you want to add that one to the gig.
No, it's not assessment, it's classification.
Yeah, because I think you have one assessor for a county that certainly classifies properties in a very unique way. So I'm all for assessor parity too, anyway, Representative.
And
that's cool.
I just want to pick up on what Senator McConaughey saying. I think no one suggests for a minute that people like Ron and Karen are not concerned about taking care of the least among us, the children who come from the poorest of backgrounds. Of course they want to do. But maybe it would help the discussion if we were able to fix this problem that so much of our schools funding relies upon property taxes. Your property taxpayers are legitimately cranky because they are paying a very significant sum for schools. If they were living in Ohio, if they were living in California, if they were living in New Jersey, they would not be spending that larger portion of their property tax dollar to fund public education. So if we can find a way out of that morass, it would help not only with the overall funding problem, but it might help you explain to your taxpayers why some different kind of funding for public education is actually an advantage to them.
Good answer. By the way, I hope you caught how some people are voting. She threw that off the top of her head. You could see why you're batting number 2, Ms. Curry. That's a very impressive display there for all you fans of the legislature. Now we have one question from Lisa Kulsik discussing the issue of race, and I don't think we need to get onto that because we're talking about, I don't think anyone's going to say this is all racism, so we'll just skip that one. And also, Jennifer Burrows, Illinois ranks 48 out of 50 in funding for education. Yes? No, if I mischaracterize it, I mean, kind of small print for me, too. You know, you caught me. Blah, 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 blah. Your daughter's doing great in Chicago, and, well, what's the question? Stand up and say, well, in the 2 sentences. Okay, thank you.
Right.
Very good question. Sorry for not reading the whole thing, but you basically said it verbatim. I'm sure you all want to jump on that one. Go right ahead.
You know, can I just say something about this?
Yeah,
not to get into a totally different subject, but this really, in my mind, plays to how we redistricting and how we draw districts in the state of Illinois. Before I came to the General Assembly, I was chair of the Kane County Board, where I had a diverse population of Hispanic, African American, white, all levels of income, challenging neighborhoods, affluent neighborhoods. And I found it a lot I found it that I could do I was doing a better job when I had a diversity of interests and demographics to represent. It put me in a position where I had to do what the right thing was for everybody. The way our districts are drawn, I will tell you, I have less than 5% minorities in my district. That's atrocious. How is a representative, whether it's a representative or a senator, is supposed to understand the challenges? We have a multitude of challenges across the state. But the way our districts are drawn, we have very limited demographics of voters that we serve. So what I have to deal with is completely unrelatable to most legislators that come from the city of Chicago, and that's wrong. Anyway, sorry.
I guess I would just say that geography and race tend to go together in our society and in our state. So it isn't surprising that there may be affluent, mostly white suburban territory where people like Karen get to be the state senator. And in fact, one of the things about our current system of drawing maps in Illinois is that there is a very clear mandate that people may not find themselves victims of discrimination based on race, based on ethnicity. So there is a very high value in our system of drawing maps that says that you can't district so that African American communities, Latino communities, even Asian American communities are left before you even get to the starting block. So that is important, and if race didn't go with geography, we would not have that problem.
That is someone who's testified many times before the various redistricting commissions and written about it. Absolutely true. And that's what's going to happen to this new effort. The people who are going to be against it are going to be minorities because they're going to be either stretched out where they can't elect somebody of their choice, or they're going to be stacked where they're going to have only people of their same race. So your question's good in a perfect society, but the way this works out, it's going to be a real battle because the people who you think you're helping are the people who are going to be against it. Well, how about a big round of applause?
Hi, I'm Jim McNamee, President of the Illinois Public Pension Fund Association. Since 1985, we've worked to educate the public and those who serve as trustees and pension boards about issues that impact the financial health of publicly funded pensions. Our members manage over $18 billion in pension assets. That's a huge number. But we never forget those dollars belong to the men and women who've worked as firefighters, police officers, and as educators. We want them to know that their pension dollars are safely invested. They also want to know that someone will keep an eye on legislation that could threaten their pension. And that's why the Illinois Public Pension Fund Association is fighting against laws that would reduce the pensions earned by our members. And this is why we support the work of the Illinois Channel. Their unbiased, in-depth coverage of the pension reform issue allows us and our members to hear arguments on both sides of the pension issue, to follow legislation as it moves through committee, or to hear unedited interviews with key lawmakers as they discuss what changes are being considered. Pensions are very important. They're also very complex. Pension reform can't adequately be covered in sound bites. But the Illinois Channel provides a connection to the Capitol, the governor, and lawmakers that we all need to stay on top of key issues. Hi, I'm Jim McNamee, president of the Illinois Public Pension Fund Association. I watch the Illinois Channel, and I hope you do too.
Next from Peoria, State Representative John Cabello speaks from the Illinois GOP State Convention about why he's supporting Donald Trump for president. This runs about 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. It's great to see everybody here. The last time I think I was at a state convention, we did not have as many people. It is good to see the Republicans deciding that we are going to fight for our state and we're going to fight for our country. Ladies and gentlemen, I am a proud representative from the 68th District in Rockford, Illinois, Winnebago County. I have been a policeman for 20 years. Which is one of the reasons why I was drawn to Donald Trump. Donald Trump has been out there supporting and talking about great things that our police officers are doing every single day. They are under attack right now, and it's time for the silent majority to stand with them. I am also proud of my Hispanic descent. I don't say that I'm a Hispanic American. I am an American with Hispanic descent. Do not believe all of the things that you are seeing on TV. Do not believe all of the things that you are listening to from the pundits that are trying to make sure that the Republicans do not rise to the level that we need to be back at. Our party does the hard things. We are the party that fought to free the slaves. We are the party that fought for the woman's right to vote. It is time that we make sure that people remember that. Donald Trump supports our Second Amendment. Donald Trump supports our strong military. Our military has been so depleted in the last 8 years. We need somebody that's going to stand up, number one, and take care of our vets, but number two, to bring our military back where it needs to be. I believe he's got an unbelievable plan to bring back our economy as well. Our state has been run into the ground. I believe that our country is being run into the ground. I believe that it's time we all stand together, get behind our nominee, Donald Trump, get behind our governor, get behind our comptroller, get behind everybody that's running on the Republican side in this election, and do whatever we can to help them. Government should stand by our side, not ride on our back. And it's time to change. I know it's been a long day. You've been sitting for quite some time, so I will bring my remarks to a close. We appreciate you here. We appreciate everything that you do. We might not agree on every single issue. We might have those tough discussions, and that's okay, because that's what we do. We do the hard things. But please, talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors. I, for one, am tired of being in the super minority. God bless you. Let's help make Illinois and America great again.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.
Next, from Washington, D.C., at the Conservative Political Action Conference, we talked to Meredith Walker, one of the co-hosts for the Two Conservative Lesbians podcast, about her experiences as a non-traditional conservative voter and what the conservative movement is doing to attract more minority voters. This runs about 5 minutes.
Meredith Walker, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel. You put out a podcast called Two Conservative Lesbians. I take it you're a conservative lesbian.
I am, yes.
Some people might find that interesting. It seems as if in our political conversations on a national level that the Democratic Party has captured at least on an outward basis, the votes and the attention of the gay community, for lack of a better term. Why are you a conservative lesbian?
Well, because I believe in conservative principles. I believe that small government is better for us. I believe that it's better for the country and for gay people in general. I think that if they realize what conservative principles can do for them, we would have a lot more voting for us. And we all care about jobs. We all care about our finances. We all care about regulations that make us more difficult to run our own businesses and run our own lives. And I think that there's just a general misunderstanding between the gay community and the conservative community as to how they can work together.
Yeah, I guess there's a couple of thoughts here. On one hand, someone might say what anyone does in the bedroom shouldn't matter if they're a liberal or a conservative. You can have a heterosexual be a conservative or be a liberal. No one would think that odd. On the other hand, I guess it's that the social conservatives versus the fiscal conservatives have been against homosexual rights. I'm trying to think in terms of some of the legislation that's gone through. And that's still a point of contention, as you know, here among those attending the CPAC conference. When you get into your conversations with conservative friends, but they find out because you're not hiding that you're lesbian, is it an issue? Are people interested? What kind of reaction do you get from other conservatives?
Really, the reaction from conservatives is pretty open. I very rarely get any hate or any sort of backlash from conservatives on that topic. Really, they're pretty open to it. And in fact, a lot of people are very excited about it. Last night, I was at a bar with some other people from CPAC, and I handed out my business card. And he just got so excited about meeting a gay conservative and wanted to talk to me all about my show and everything. And it's a way better reaction than I ever get from liberals on the topic.
What do liberals say to you?
Anything from you're a traitor, you're self-loathing, you should. I've had death threats. I've had people tell me I should kill myself. It's a whole big thing, and it's because they misunderstand what conservatism is about. They think that somehow I'm for locking gay people up on an island or gassing them like I'm a Nazi or something like that. And I don't understand that.
And why are you somewhat touch on this? Well, your podcast. What do you talk about on your podcast? And what's it called? We already gave the title on one hand, but what's it called and where can people find it?
Well, it's called Two Conservative Lesbians, and it's on Spreaker, and we have our own website, which is twoconservativelesbians.com as well. You can find all of our contact info there. And mostly we don't even really talk about social issues that much or issues pertaining to the gay community. Sometimes we touch on it. Mostly we just talk about politics and talk about current events and what's going on in the world, what's going on in D.C., that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, as we look here, we have Ben Carson, a black conservative Republican, and there wasn't too many years ago people thought it was all blacks would have been voting Democratic. So I think we tend to sometimes stereotype any number of people. You have a book coming out. What's the name of the book, and what does that concern?
Okay, it's called A New Breed of Elephant. It actually came out on March 1st. You can find it on Amazon. It's on the topic of minority conservatives and how to do outreach to minority communities through the Republican Party. So it's basically saying how to change our reputation, how to change our media presence, how to change all of our outreach to those communities so that we can get new voters.
And do you have a selection for the presidential campaign? Any candidate you're backing?
I'm backing Marco Rubio.
All right, well, thanks so much and good luck in your book.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Dan Montgomery, President of the Illinois Federation of Teachers. More than 100,000 IFT members work each day in schools, universities, colleges, and state agencies across Illinois. They're professionals who teach our students, keep our public buildings safe and clean, and provide critical state services, and much more. As an advocate for our members, their professions, and those we serve, the IFT works in Springfield to support legislative policies that promote high-quality schools and public services. We also fight to protect collective bargaining rights for all our members and all working men and women. We do this through an organized program of advocacy and year-round monitoring of public policy proposals. And that's why the IFT is proud to support the work of the Illinois Channel, whose coverage connects us to legislative debates and committee hearings, as well as interviews with leaders on key issues like the state budget, tax policy, public pensions, and education funding. Funding education is one of the primary responsibilities of Illinois state government. So we should all pay attention to the policies being proposed and how they may help or harm our children's futures. You know, what's happening in the State House today directly impacts what happens in classrooms tomorrow. And what happens in classrooms impacts the future of our state and our nation for decades to come. I'm Dan Montgomery, President of the Illinois Federation of Teachers, and I'm proud to serve on the Illinois Channel's Education Advisory Board. The Illinois Channel, it keeps us all connected.
Next, from Springfield, Eric Madier, the former chief legal counsel for Senate President John Cullerton, addresses an audience of the State University's Annuitants Association about the legal challenges to pension reform. This runs about 50 minutes.
Thank you for that introduction. Can you all hear me? Okay. I had asked Linda to make sure that you guys would eat first, so if you didn't like what I had to say, there would be less food for you to throw at me with my remarks. So good afternoon, and really thank you for the opportunity to talk about my favorite issue of public pensions. And the last time I was here was in June of 2011, and at that point I had published had written an article for the Senate President about the Illinois Constitution's public pension clause and its scope, and there had been a lot of debate at that time whether or not the Illinois pension clause would allow the General Assembly to make unilateral cuts in pension benefits. And at that time, there was a group with the Commercial Club of Chicago that had put out a position paper that pension benefits could be unilaterally cut. And then there was some back and forth with a lawyer, Gino DeVito, a former Illinois appellate court justice, who said, well, that's not correct. I was given the charge by the Senate President to look at both perspectives and also really to do a comprehensive analysis of the pension clause. And the conclusion I drew at that time, back in March of 2011, was that pension benefits based on the pension clause, its plain language, its history, the decisions that are out there at that time in March of 2011, is that pension benefits were absolutely protected and that the General Assembly lacked the power to unilaterally cut benefits. And that has really sort of been the narrative and viewpoint that I've had since that time. And as you know, and we'll get into, the Illinois Supreme Court has issued in the last year really 3 decisions and 4 decisions in the last couple of years on the scope of the pension clause, and the conclusion drawn is that pension benefits indeed are absolutely protected and are immune from unilateral changes made by the General Assembly. But today what I would like to talk about are, well, what are our options going forward? This issue of public pension reform, given the fiscal conditions of the state, is not going to go away. The fact that there has been some success in the courts recently from unilateral attempts by the legislature to change benefits does no way diminish the fact that attempts and thoughts will still be put forth to try and cut benefits, but in a way that will square with the pension clause. And candidly speaking, there are options that are available that can result in benefit cuts that would be consistent with the pension clause of the Constitution. And I'd like to talk about those today. So as I'll explain, while the pension clause protects pension benefits from adverse unilateral changes, pension benefits can be changed through contract principles: offer, consideration, and acceptance. There can be the use of contract principles to obtain changes in benefits that will result in savings to the state. And to that end, I'll talk about it some more. The Senate President, John Cullerton, my former boss, he has one viable approach that could result in savings and square, in my view, with the pension clause. Other types of avenues that could be pursued more recently, based on the Illinois Supreme Court decisions, is the use of collective bargaining, where the unions in the public sector can collectively bargain modifications in current pension benefits for the active employees that are members of the union. But one thing I'd like to point out, and I'll detail as well, is that attempts to amend the Illinois Constitution to allow the legislature to unilaterally cut benefits, or legislation to allow municipalities to enter bankruptcy to unilaterally discharge benefits, those are not legally viable options. So let's have our discussion begin really with the recent court decisions that have come out. As you know, and SUAA was a participant as a plaintiff, in May of 2005, the Illinois Supreme Court issued its decision dealing with Senate Bill 1. That was the 2013 pension reform bill that unilaterally cut pension benefits, the big benefit of which was the 3% compounded COLA rate that actives and retirees would receive in retirement. This decision dealt with the issue of whether the General Assembly retains some kind of so-called police power to unilaterally cut pension benefits if it provides a good reason and there's some sense of economic necessity that's been determined by the General Assembly. And the result of this litigation from the Illinois Supreme Court is that the pension clause is not subject to a so-called police powers exception. While this police powers exception exists and is understood to exist with the U.S. Constitution's contract clause, it does not equally apply to the pension clause. The Illinois Supreme Court, based on the plain language, the history of the pension clause, and its prior decisions made it abundantly clear that there is no so-called police power exception that the General Assembly can invoke and therefore use as a way to unilaterally cut benefits. One point that I found significant from this decision is that a large part of the court's analysis and narrative to support its conclusion is the fact that the state has historically underfunded the public pension systems of this state, and in a way utilized pension funding and diverted funding that would otherwise go to the pension systems in sort of a proverbial credit card way as a means in which to avoid tax increases, service cuts, or both. Now, you know, because of the fact that Senate Bill 1 unilaterally cut benefits, you know, it was my view that the outcome of this this court decision was really sort of preordained. And there were, even with that in mind and sort of a lack of surprise on my part of what the outcome would be, there were some things in the decision that I was surprised by. The first was that the decision was unanimous. Another point was that the court really forcefully reaffirmed the rule of law, and that we are a nation or a state of law. We are not a state of men and women only, but what makes us exceptional is we have constitutions. And we follow the constitutions because that is how our society is structured, is to know what the guardrails are, if you will, on the roadway and be able to contain politics within those guardrails. Another point is that I felt, I suppose, a little bit gratified as they did point out in the opinion that pension underfunding has existed in this state going back to 1917. And this is something that I had pointed out in an article back in September of 2014. But the court's decision, the Senate Bill 1 decision from last May, I think really gives us some clear guideposts as we move forward about what can be done. And in my view, I think that the court's decision gave a green light of sorts to the use of contract principles to try and get benefit reductions and save the state money and hopefully mitigate this problem and allow us to move on to other serious fiscal challenges that the state has. So as a practical matter, what did we get out of the pension clause, the Senate Bill 1 decision about the pension clause? The first, of course, that I mentioned is that the General Assembly lacks the power to unilaterally cut benefits. That's because the pension clause safeguards the benefits that are in place at the time a person joins the pension system. It also safeguards the benefits that are added while you are working. And if you continue to work after those benefits become law, those benefits are also protected because of you continuing to work. You've essentially offered further consideration in exchange for getting that benefit increase. The third point is that while the pension clause does not require that pensions be funded at a certain funding level, in that the pension system has to be 90% funded or 50% funded, in a way it's, I don't want to say almost legally irrelevant. It does require that pension benefits be paid when they become due. So the political issue is, how are we going to fund pension benefits? Are we going to think of college? You are all in some way associated with college. Parents will pay for college either on a pay-as-you-go basis and pay when the bill comes, the tuition bill arrives in the mail, or they'll pre-fund that education through some kind of savings that they've stored up over years, or probably in reality some combination of the two. So the court basically said, you're on the hook to pay these pension benefits when they become due, but you have flexibility to determine whether you're going to pre-fund it or you're going to pay as you go. Finally, the final point is, while the clause bars unilateral changes, you can use contract principles to get pension benefit changes and reductions. This then ties into the most recent case from the Illinois Supreme Court, and that was the decision issued in March of this year dealing with the Chicago Pension Reform Bill. In March, the Illinois Supreme Court issued its decision invalidating that legislation, which was very similar to Senate Bill 1, and it dealt with participants in two of the Chicago retirement systems, the municipal and laborers' employees' annuity funds. And the pension reform bill for these two Chicago systems also unilaterally cut the COLA rate that you would receive in retirement, not only for the active employees, but also for the retirees. Given the similarities of that pension reform bill with what was previously invalidated, the court found that the changes that were made were unilateral changes and they were unconstitutional because they violated the pension clause. Now, what's interesting about the litigation for the Chicago pension reform bill is that initially the city of Chicago tried to use the same police powers theory that the state tried to use for the state reform bill. But while that litigation was going on, the Illinois Supreme Court issued its Senate Bill 1 decision. So the city of Chicago realized that that particular argument or defense was no longer valid. So they came up with two other arguments to try and uphold that legislation. And both of these arguments were not persuasive to the trial court judge in Cook County, and nor were they ultimately persuasive to the Illinois Supreme Court. The first argument that the city had is that they claimed that the bill that was passed was constitutional because it provided Tier 1 participants in these two systems with some kind of net benefit. And the net benefit was that the city is not obligated to fund these local pension systems if they go broke. And by this legislation, what the city has agreed to do is it will now statutorily be obligated to fund these systems on an actuarial basis. And because we are now going to fund these systems, the trade-off of a lower COLA results in the fact that rather than you getting nothing if the pension system here for these two local systems go broke, but you'll get a net benefit because you at least will get paid some kind of benefits, albeit at a lower rate. And really the city's argument was premised on a 1963 statute that obviously predated the 1970 Constitution. A provision that said if these local pension systems go broke, you're out of luck. If there's no money in it, there's no obligation for the city to step in and continue to pay benefits. The Illinois Supreme Court identified really three fatal flaws with the city's argument and this net benefit theory. First, it said that the new statutory funding schedule was just that. It was a statutory funding schedule that the legislature could come in and change at any time. So if the schedule said you needed to achieve 90% funding by the year 2055, it can change it and say, well, it needs to be 80% funded, and it could just continue to change the funding schedule where there really wasn't any certainty that the pension systems in these two local funds would get some kind of sound and stable funding. It really was sort of illusory because statutes, like anything else, or any other statute, could be changed at any time. The second a point that the court made was that the pension clause itself required the city, as the local employer, to ultimately make pension payments should one of these two pension funds go broke. So this argument that the statute from 1963 somehow absolved the cities from having to step up and pay pensions should those local pension funds go broke did not wash. It was the pension clause itself that trumped and made this 1963 provision no longer operative. It was the city ultimately that would need to come up with the money if these local systems were insolvent. So these were really the two arguments, and the third of which is that because of, and I shared it, is that because the pension clause came after this 1963 provision, a constitutional provision will always trump the effect or the legal effect of a prior statute. The second argument that the city tried to use to defend its pension reform bill was that this legislation really represented a bargained exchange between the unions and the city. And it needed to be recognized as such, and it was a trade-off. And the city pointed to the fact that for about 2 years it had been working with the 31 labor unions that comprised the participants in these two local pension funds, and that 28 of the 31 unions had agreed to these benefit cuts with the city. And so, given contract principles being available as a means to cut pension benefits, the court should uphold this legislation as really a product of some kind of contractual exchange between the unions and the city of Chicago. Now, the court rejected this argument because it found that what had happened here is you had a piece of legislation that was developed like really any other piece of legislation. You had different stakeholders who got together with other stakeholders, and they worked out legislation, and then they came to Springfield to pass a bill. But what had not been done with this legislation is that it was not the product of collective bargaining between these 28 unions and the city of Chicago. And so it really, as a basic position of contract law, is that the union leaders who had worked out this deal really didn't have the authority to bind their members to the agreement itself and what was reflected in the legislation. And that's because they were not acting in a collective bargaining capacity. They had not used the collective bargaining process to completion, where the agreement would have been put on the table, memorialized in a collective bargaining agreement, and had some kind of ratification vote. None of those steps were taken. Above and beyond that, you still had non-union employees who were also bound by this legislation. And you also had 3 of the unions who did not agree with the legislation and who actually opposed the legislation, who were also bound by it. So just in terms of basic contract principles, you had a failure of the fact that the unions that were entering into this agreement really didn't have the authority to bind their members in the first place, nor did they have the power to bind retirees or the members of other unions that were opposed to the legislation. But what was very clear from the court's decision is that it made its prior decisions really, in my view, clear that you can use contract principles to cut benefits, but you have to use those principles in a legitimate way. And it also indicated you can utilize the collective bargaining process, and the unions, if they are acting in the collective bargaining process, can cut benefits. But it would have to be through the collective bargaining process if that's what the union is looking to do. separate and apart. You do have just collective contract principles being able to be used to cut benefits. So this leads us to really, where do we go from here? And in my view, in light of the Senate Bill 1 decision and the City of Chicago decision that came down recently, there are really three options that we have. And the first option is that the General Assembly can pursue the contractual approach that was outlined by Senate President Cullerton to obtain benefit cuts in a way that really squares with the pension clause. And this was really put out there back in 2012 or 2013 as Senate Bill 2404. And the heart of the proposal really is something that is permissible today. So, well, what is that proposal? Under this proposal, Tier 1 employees would have the choice of either giving up their 3% compounded COLA rate for a lower COLA rate, maybe a 3% simple, maybe the Tier 2 COLA rate, or just keeping the current COLA that they have. If they agree to give up their compounded COLA, then the state would agree to never offer future raises on a non-pensionable basis. If folks do not want this deal, that's fine. They could reject it, and they will obviously keep their 3% compounded COLA when they retire, but the state would only offer future raises to those folks on a non-pensionable basis. Either way, based on the choice, there are negative consequences. The state will be saving money. But the fact of the matter is that future raises are not something that a public employer has to offer on an unconditional basis. That means, let's take an example of a person who's making $50,000 a year today. The state, as it has in the past, can give raises, a $5,000 raise with no strings attached. So your salary goes from $50,000 to $55,000. Not only is that $5,000 extra in your pocket for today, but it also increases your final average pensionable salary down the road. And that's because the employer has offered you the raise with no strings attached to it. Based on New York court decisions, and again, our pension clause is based on the 1938 New York pension clause, based on decisions from that state, the public employer has the right, it has not used this right, but it has the right to offer future raises under the condition that if you accept them, they'll count as money in your pocket, but they won't count towards your pension when you retire. So the heart of this proposal the Senate President has is if you're at $50,000 and you take the deal, you're going to agree to take a lower COLA. And then if you get raises that take your salary from $50,000 to $75,000, those raises are going to count toward your pension. But you've agreed to take a lower COLA in retirement. If you decide, I'm near the end of my career in state government, I'm not looking at getting future raises in the next couple of years anyways, I'm at $50,000, maybe I do get a couple more raises that brings me up to $10,000 more, where you're going from $50,000 to $60,000, your pension will be based on $50,000, not the $60,000 level, and you will get your 3% compounded COLA based on that $50,000 level. Now, there was a more recent decision that was handed down by the Illinois Supreme Court in May that dealt with the CTA. It was Matthews versus the Chicago Transit Authority. And that decision really, once again, reiterated that contract principles can be used to reduce and change pension benefits, as well as the fact that the unions can, through collective bargaining, modify the benefits of its active members through the collective bargaining process. So, simply put, the notion that pension benefits are cast in stone and they cannot be changed under any circumstances is not correct. Now, aside from using a contract approach to reduce benefits, there are some other things that the state can consider as well. One of which would be to change the current funding schedule that we have today. We are, in all intents and purposes, still under the 1995 funding plan that has us seeking to achieve 90% funding by the year 2045. We could re-amortize that schedule to where we're going to try and have 80% funding, maybe in 2055. And rather than having funding that looks like the American Eagle roller coaster ride, which is what we have today, we can try and flatten out our payments much like you would for your mortgage, where you're paying a flat amount every year. They call that a level dollar approach to funding pensions. One concern with that is in order to get on a level dollar funding, we would have to pay more into the pension system than we're paying currently. So we sort of have a fiscal problem today with paying what we're paying now, so we'd have to really get ultimately at the bigger issue, which is restructuring the way we raise revenue in this state so we're able to meet our obligations, not simply defer them. Another option that's been put out there is to try and have some kind of partial buyout of the benefits of current employees before they would retire. The notion being that if you give folks some kind of immediate upfront payment, maybe 75 cents on the dollar, that's a way that the state could obtain savings. One proposal that had been put out there by a member of the General Assembly, the thought would be you could partially buy out your pension benefits, and in doing some actuarial math on that, they thought that maybe 10% of participants would be interested in that proposal, and it would save the state about $160 million based upon current pension payments of about $7 billion. So, you know, we're talking about proposals here that are going to mitigate the problem. It's not going to be a silver bullet and solve the problem. We're still going to have to pay the benefits that become due. We can help lessen the blow, but we're still going to have to restructure the means of raising revenue in the state to meet our obligations. And that's really the ultimate point, is that we got into this mess by not properly funding the pension systems because we've had a poorly designed revenue structure that has not given us the revenue sources we need to meet our obligations. There are two other proposals that are out there that are worth mentioning. I don't consider these to be viable options. The first proposal would be to allow municipalities to file for Chapter 9 bankruptcy to discharge their pension obligations through a bankruptcy court-approved plan. The second proposal is to amend the pension clause to permit the General Assembly to unilaterally cut pension benefits of current employees on a going-forward basis. As I mentioned, I don't think either of these proposals are legally viable. House Bill 4427 is the proposal that would allow municipalities to file for Chapter 9 bankruptcy. And the proposal is really inspired by what had taken place in Detroit, where the Detroit bankruptcy, and they have a similar pension clause in the Michigan Constitution, and the bankruptcy court in Detroit, finding that that provision of the Constitution did not act as an obstacle to allow Detroit and its emergency manager to cut the pension benefits in that state. And the supporters of having Chapter 9 bankruptcy in Illinois see that this is another way, at least perhaps to put some pressure on labor unions to come to the table and bargain, but others to perhaps have this as a way to protect bondholders and really allow unilateral cuts in pension benefits at the local level. And really the pressure point is that we have here is the fact that downstate communities, suburban communities have to contribute to IMRF, and they also have to contribute to their downstate and police pension systems. And through the state legislation, there's intercept language that if there's money destined for those local communities from the state, those monies can be intercepted and diverted into the local public pension plans. There's been a lot of hearings over the last year about Chapter 9 bankruptcy, and I've been spending, unfortunately, this becoming sort of a new mistress for me, much like pensions has been a mistress, according to my wife, since 2011, where I've looked at Chapter 9 of the Bankruptcy Code. I've looked at its legislative history. I've looked at many of its decisions, and I'm just not convinced that this is even a viable option. And it really boils down to this. In order for an Illinois municipality to get into federal bankruptcy court, the Federal Bankruptcy Code, Congress, requires the state of Illinois to pass a valid state law authorizing its municipalities to get into bankruptcy court. And the Illinois Supreme Court decisions that have come down recently have made it abundantly clear that the legislature simply lacks the legal state law power to pass a statute that will result in the unilateral reduction of pension benefits. And this is not something that they had to confront in Detroit nor in California when they were dealing with pensions, because it was understood that the pensions that were protected in those states had no better protection than what you would have for a contract under the federal contract clause. The Illinois Supreme Court made it clear that there is elevated protection for public pensions when it comes to public pension benefits in Illinois. That was not a legal issue that they had to confront in Detroit or California. So those cases, I think, are of interest, but they're not of any controlling interest, of course, in Illinois. The final proposal is something that's been sought by the Civic Federation of Chicago. Their proposal would be to amend Article 13, Section 5, the pension clause of the Illinois Constitution, to specifically write into it that the General Assembly could make unilateral cuts in pension benefits of current employees. Now, you know, there's some political hurdles in order to get a constitutional amendment on the ballot. First, the amendment would have to be adopted by 3/5 of the members of the Senate and the House. Senate Bill 1 passed with barely a majority in both the House and Senate, so having a much higher vote requirement, I think, dictates that that would be a tall order to have the necessary 3/5 vote of the legislature. But it would also need to be ratified by the voters. And the next opportunity to amend the Illinois Constitution would be 2018. There was a window to put amendments on the ballot for the 2016 election, but that window closed in early May of this year. So, but even assuming that you had these political hurdles overcome where you had a constitutional amendment on the ballot and the voters ratified it, I still believe you'd have a legal challenge in court that that pension amendment would be unconstitutional under the U.S. Constitution, and it specifically being violative of the Takings Clause of the U.S. Constitution and also what's known as the Contract Clause of the Constitution. So in closing, the state and the city of Chicago's pension obligations are undoubtedly posing a daunting fiscal challenge. And things are clearly bad, but I just want to share with you a little history that, you know, they've actually been worse. And I know that's hard to take, but just bear with me. In 1841, Illinois defaulted on its annual interest payments it owed on $14 million in bonds that had been issued to build railroads and canals in this state. That debt was described as insurmountable because the state's annual interest payment was nearly $800,000. Back then, that was a lot of money. But the state only collected about $98,000 a year in revenue. So they had $800,000 in interest payments to pay its bonds, but it only brought in about $100,000 a year to the state. Immigration into Illinois ceased because of the prospect of high taxation. Any real estate that was really in place already was difficult to sell. Unsurprisingly, there was a strong hue and cry by elected officials and the press alike to simply repudiate that debt, much like Michigan, had done, and other states at that time. They repudiated their debt. And it was really something that had a lot of political favor because the money was owed to people out of state. Why do we care, right? They're not our people. Well, obviously, the money is owed on pensions to people here. Illinois Governor Thomas Ford, who took office in 1842, rejected the call for repudiation, and he succeeded in forcing the state to assume its responsibilities and save the state's credit rating. Governor Ford did this by negotiating with the state's creditors to mitigate the debt that was owed, and by imposing a special state property tax to repay the debt, and also sold state property. We had a lot of state property that we had received from the federal government. We were early in our years as a state, so the state would receive a share of the proceeds from the sale. This special tax was put into the Illinois Constitution in 1848, and we ultimately did not pay off these debts until the 1880s. But by 1846, when Ford left office, Illinois was no longer held in disrepute by other states and its creditors, and the state's population grew. So just like we had these insurmountable debts because of these internal improvement debt obligations that we had taken on, our pension obligations are not insurmountable, okay? But what it is it's going to take a tremendous amount of political will in order to do something to help mitigate this problem. And ultimately, it's going to require the state to restructure the revenue structure it has to raise revenue so it can meet its obligations. So those are my comments. I appreciate your time. Thank you. Anybody? Do we have time for questions? Or okay. Sir, back of the room.
In your opinion, is the 3% automatic annual increase protected by the Constitution, or can it be altered?
It is protected by the Constitution. The Senate Bill 1 decision that came down in May of 15 makes that clear, but it can be changed through contract principles. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I'd like to know how health care benefits fit into this picture, because the Illinois Supreme Court said in that decision that health care was part of the pension clause. And since we generally, I think historically, had our health care benefits linked with the AFSCME negotiations, and since the governor right now is trying to say that there's an impasse, are we, to what extent will we be affected by that? My understanding is they can't charge us premiums, but they could raise our deductibles and co-pays depending on the negotiations with AFSCME. Is that correct?
In fact, I was asked about health care back in 2011, and I didn't have an answer at that time, and you're right, we do have an answer to that now. We have the Canerva decision, which came down in July of 2014, which recognized that the pension premium, the premium subsidies on health care is recognized as a protected pension benefit because your membership, by being a member, you have been able to obtain that benefit by being a member of the pension system. I think there's a question. I think it's clear that the premium subsidy is what has been recognized as a protected benefit. There's some question about there whether they can change unilaterally the deductibles and the co-payments. That is an unresolved legal issue, And in fact, when they were litigating the Connecticut case in the trial court here in Sangamon County, one of the questions from the trial court judge was, you're telling me that the premium subsidy is protected, but what about when it comes to the co-pays and deductibles? Can the state change those? And the answer from counsel on the plaintiff side was yes. So, but that is a matter that would need to be litigated, and it hasn't been at this point. Yes, sir.
What other kinds of considerations do you see that could be on the horizon? Right now you talked about kind of a consideration for the COLA versus salary increase, but there are other considerations that you might be able to think of.
That's correct. You know, this is just one example of something that can be used as consideration. The way courts view consideration is that the one party is offering something of benefit to the other party, or it's going to be a detriment on the party making the offer. Okay? And really, that can be a whole host of things. It could be a cash payout. It could be some kind of job protection. You know, there's a whole host of things. But in light of the fact that we do have collective bargaining in this state, a lot of those things about keeping your job and not being fired for cause, a lot of those things are already locked in through the collective bargaining process. So you'd have to find something that's really not captured by that as being of value from that standpoint. I hope that answers your question.
Well, yeah, I mean, conceivably, we could say, okay, current employees, you need to pay a little bit more into your pension fund for blank, blank, blank. I don't know what.
Well, in the past, when they've done some benefit increases, they have raised the contribution rate at the same time that they passed that legislation. And that makes sense because you're getting something new. Rather than you just keep working as is, we want you to also give a 0.5% more of salary. They can do that, but if it's the issue of just staying where you're at your level of benefit, but unilaterally increasing your, that I don't think that would square with the Constitution. Yes, ma'am.
I can understand consideration for current employees. Can you think of anything at all for someone who's retired and is now already receiving pensions and health insurance benefits?
Well, it goes back to her question earlier, was what discretion does the state have to utilize some changes in co-pays and deductibles on health care? Off the top of my head, that would be one. There might be others. I mean, if the state were flush with cash, of course, it could try and provide some kind of buyout. But we know we're in a precarious fiscal situation, and that's not on the horizon.
One more question.
Yes, sir.
About 95% of my career, we were allowed to have 2 years of unused sick days being used for retirement. Just before I was about to retire, Jay made a decision that it would be 1 year. Considering the Supreme Court decision, is there any way we can get that 1 year back?
I'm not familiar with the context, so I wouldn't try and hazard a guess. If it's been part of the regime that the sick time is a little bit different because you accrue sick time, and that doesn't lock in stone the ability to change the future accrual of the sick time, arguably. I just wouldn't want to hazard a guess. I would need to know more. So I appreciate your time. Thank you for the opportunity.
Hi, I'm Delitso Solomoyo, President of the Illinois Association of Community Action Agencies. We are an organization of 36 member agencies located around Illinois which provide needed services to our fellow citizens. It may be helping provide services at a homeless shelter or helping to provide affordable utilities to low-income people across Illinois through such programs as the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, better known as LIHEAP, or working with rural communities and helping them maintain needed community infrastructure. These are just a few of the many services provided by Illinois' community action agencies. But to provide these services efficiently and effectively, we need solid information. That's why, in addition to heading the Illinois Association of Community Action Agencies, I am also proud to serve on the Illinois Channel's Advisory Council. I have watched the Illinois Channel for years. It provides serious coverage of the Illinois legislature, public policy discussions, and one-on-one interviews with leaders from across Illinois. It's the kind of solid, in-depth information all of us need to get beyond partisan politics and political spin and just hear directly what's happening, what's being proposed, and why. I know and you know that Illinois is filled with good people. But if we are to have good, effective public policies, we need to base those on good information. We get that from the Illinois Channel. That's why I watch it, and I hope you will too. The Illinois Channel, it works for all of us.